Welcome to the Trackpads Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
A gray freighter rolled heavily in the Atlantic swell, her silhouette plain, almost homely. She was no cruiser, no destroyer, not even a sleek liner pressed into service. She was box-shaped, slow, and built with little thought for beauty. Yet, below decks a triple-expansion steam engine beat like a mechanical heart, driving her forward at 11 knots. To those who served on her, she was more than steel plates and rivets. She was a lifeline. Liberty ships like this one, the Jeremiah O'Brien among them, became the invisible thread stitching together continents in war. They carried not only cargo, but the very survival of nations. For Britain, starved by U-boats, each arriving freighter was as precious as an army division. For the United States, these ships represented proof that industry and willpower could be transformed into victory at sea. The stakes were immense. In the early years of the war, Allied shipping losses mounted at terrifying rates. German submarines sought to choke Britain into submission, torpedoing freighters faster than they could be replaced. Food shortages loomed, armies in the field teetered on the brink of supply collapse, and the Atlantic itself became a battlefield of attrition. The Liberty ship was America's answer, an emergency fleet that could be built faster than the enemy could destroy it. They were not glamorous and not admired by naval architects, but they were exactly what was needed. Built in their thousands, they flooded the oceans, a steel tide carrying hope and sustenance. Amid this fleet, the Jeremiah O'Brien was one ship among many. She had no destiny written for her beyond service, no expectation of becoming a symbol. Yet history often chooses its survivors, and the O'Brien endured. Her wartime service, from Atlantic convoys to the beaches of Normandy, mirrored the experiences of her sisters. Through her preserved hull, we glimpse not only her own story but the collective struggle of the 710 Liberty ships and the countless men who sailed them. Her survival into the modern day transforms her into something greater, a living bridge to the wartime years, her steam engine still echoing with the rhythm of victory. This is a story not only of steel and design, but of endurance, of the quiet courage of merchant mariners and armed guards, and of the industrial mobilization that redefined warfare. The Liberty ship program proved that mass production could be a weapon, that ordinary vessels could achieve extraordinary impact. The Jeremiah O'Brien, steaming today as she did 80 years ago, reminds us that wars are not won by soldiers alone, but by the invisible lifelines that sustain them. To understand her story is to understand how logistics became the true arsenal of democracy, and how one ungainly freighter stands today as the voice of a forgotten fleet. The blueprint for the Liberty ship began with an act of desperation. Britain, reeling under U-boat attacks, realized her own shipyards could never keep pace with the destruction. An appeal went out to America: build us ships, quickly and cheaply. The design chosen was not glamorous. It came from a British freighter known as the Ocean type, a vessel whose virtue lay in simplicity. American engineers adapted it into the EC2 SC1, what the world would come to call the Liberty ship. Every decision favored speed and scale. Instead of modern turbines, most Liberties carried antiquated triple-expansion engines, reliable if slow. Their speed rarely exceeded 11 knots, but in wartime arithmetic, slowness was acceptable if it came with numbers. The concept was simple: replace ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The true revolution was not in the blueprint but in the method of building. Traditional shipyards worked slowly, laboring over riveted holes and individually crafted parts. The Liberty ship program introduced welding and prefabrication on a grand scale. Entire sections were manufactured off-site, transported to the yards, and fused together like pieces of a puzzle. Welding was faster and required less specialized skill, which meant workers could be trained quickly. It did bring problems, with hull cracks haunting some early launches, but the gains outweighed the flaws. In an age of emergency, pragmatism triumphed. These ships were never meant to last decades. They were built for 5 years of hard service, enough to outlast the war. Henry J. Kaiser became the unlikely hero of this industrial crusade. An industrialist with no maritime background, he transformed shipbuilding into an assembly line miracle. His West Coast yards operated around the clock, illuminated by the sparks of welders and the roar of cranes. He hired anyone who could work, women, minorities, immigrants, and trained them on the job. Kaiser's miracle yards, as they became known, produced Liberty ships at breathtaking speed. The record was 4 days, 15 hours from keel to launch, a feat as much propaganda as production but no less symbolic. It showed the world that America's industrial muscle could be harnessed with almost frightening efficiency. Where one shipyard had once built a handful of ships a year, now hundreds poured into the oceans. Life in the shipyards was its own wartime battle. Workers endured long shifts, dangerous conditions, and relentless pressure. Yet pride coursed through the ranks. Each launch was a ceremony, often with crowds gathered to see a new vessel christened and sent sliding into the water. For welders and riveters, many of whom had never seen the ocean before, each Liberty ship was tangible proof of their contribution to victory. Propaganda posters celebrated them as soldiers of the home front, their torches and hammers weapons in a different kind of war. Communities swelled around the yards, with hastily built housing and schools, reshaping the social fabric of coastal America. The Liberty ship was not just an industrial product, it was a social phenomenon. Critics mocked them as ugly ducklings, boxy and uninspiring, but the admirals and generals who relied on them understood their worth. A Liberty ship could carry more than 9,000 tons of cargo. A convoy of 30 meant supplies enough to sustain an army. No single Liberty mattered, but the fleet together was invincible in its logic. Losses were inevitable, but replacements were certain. In their ungainly silhouettes lay a new philosophy of war. Victory not through elegance, but through sheer unstoppable production. Convoys became the crucible in which Liberty ships proved their worth. Alone, a freighter plodding at 11 knots was little more than a target, but in formation, dozens of them together became a moving fortress. Escorts shepherded these convoys, destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers armed with sonar and depth charges, circling constantly to shield their charges. Discipline was absolute. Ships held their stations, zigzagging at ordered intervals to spoil torpedo solutions. To drift out of line was to gamble with disaster, leaving a gap the enemy could exploit. For the sailors aboard, the ocean itself became a battlefield, where silence, patience, and steadiness were weapons as potent as guns. Convoy life was monotonous, but beneath the monotony lurked constant peril, every wake and shadow a reminder of unseen threats. The German U-boat menace was relentless. Wolfpacks prowled the Atlantic, coordinated by radio signals that guided them toward Allied convoys. Under cover of darkness, submarines surfaced, their decks bristling with torpedo tubes, and moved in for the kill. Attacks came suddenly, explosions splitting the night, ships vanishing in plumes of fire and spray, the acrid smell of burning oil spreading across the water. Survivors often watched helplessly as comrades flailed in the cold sea, lifeboats lowered in frantic haste. For Liberty ship crews, each night crossing the Atlantic was a test of endurance, a question of whether they would see dawn. It was a grim lottery, one in which luck and discipline both mattered, but neither could guarantee survival. The Allies fought back with science and persistence. High-frequency direction finding allowed escorts to triangulate U-boat transmissions, while radar extended the eyes of the fleet. Escort carriers brought fighter planes into mid-ocean, once beyond the range of land-based patrols. Depth charges thundered beneath the waves, forcing submarines into evasive dives. Each innovation tilted the balance slowly, grinding down the German offensive. By 1943, convoys were no longer defenseless herds. They were predators in their own right, hunting the very submarines that had once stalked them. For the sailors of Liberty ships, this shift was palpable. Danger never vanished, but the odds improved, and hope began to replace despair. Even as escorts and aircraft blunted the submarine threat, another enemy never relented: the Atlantic itself. Storms rolled across the ocean with brutal force, smashing ships with towering seas and howling winds. Crews fought to keep decks clear of ice, hacking at frozen railings with axes as spray froze instantly in the frigid air. Steering gear jammed, cargo shifted violently, and engines strained against relentless pounding. Yet paradoxically, the same storms that battered the Liberties also shielded them. Aircraft could not fly in such weather, and submarines struggled to attack in towering swells. For mariners, misery and salvation were entwined. Survival demanded endurance, not only of the enemy but of the sea itself. Damage control became a second nature aboard Liberty ships. Crews drilled tirelessly, knowing that a torpedo's impact or a direct hit from a bomb might cripple but not necessarily sink their vessel. Pumps stood ready. Bulkheads were reinforced, and makeshift repairs became acts of desperate ingenuity. There were stories of Liberty staggering into port with their bows torn away, decks gutted by fire, or hulls cracked nearly in two. Each battered survivor told a tale of grit, of crews who refused to yield their ship to the sea. These stories circulated among sailors, both cautionary and inspiring, reminders that even when disaster struck, human determination could keep a freighter alive long enough to deliver her precious cargo. The turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a triumph of weapons and machines, but of endurance. Convoys, once vulnerable herds, became resilient arteries of war, kept alive by escorts above, technology behind the scenes, and the unyielding will of the men who sailed. For Liberty ship crews, every successful crossing was a victory measured not in headlines, but in the simple fact of arrival. Each ton landed in Britain, each soldier supplied in North Africa, was proof that the gauntlet could be run, and that even slow, ungainly ships could defy the ocean and the enemy alike. The human story of the Liberty ships was written not only in steel but in sweat, fear, and stubborn endurance. Crewing these vessels were merchant mariners, civilians drawn from farms, factories, and fishing ports, men of all ages who signed on for dangerous voyages. They were not enlisted soldiers, yet their casualty rates were among the highest of the war. Alongside them served detachments of the Navy Armed Guard uniformed sailors assigned to man the guns bolted to the decks. Two worlds met in cramped quarters, civilian seafarers focused on moving cargo and naval ratings charged with defense. At first uneasy, the relationship grew into a brotherhood, tested by nights under blackout and sudden alarms. Together they formed a hybrid crew, bound not by tradition but by necessity. Daily life aboard a Liberty ship was a study in contrasts. There was monotony, endless watches on the bridge, chipping rust from the decks, shoveling coal or tending boilers in the stifling engine room. There was drudgery hauling cargo slings, cleaning bilges, cooking meals for a weary crew. Yet woven into the routine were jolts of terror. A torpedo struck without warning. A plane appeared suddenly overhead, and monotony dissolved into chaos. Sleep came in fitful snatches, meals were eaten quickly, and comfort was measured in a hot mug of coffee or a letter from home. For the men, survival meant adapting to a rhythm where boredom and terror marched side by side. Recognition was scarce. Merchant mariners carried the war on their shoulders, but for decades after the conflict, they were denied the benefits given to veterans. Many felt forgotten, their sacrifices overlooked in the post-war celebration of soldiers and sailors. Pay was decent by wartime standards, but no paycheck could compensate for nights spent in lifeboats, survivors adrift after their ships were sunk. The Navy Armed Guard fared somewhat better in terms of official recognition, but their role was overshadowed by the exploits of larger combat ships. Both groups were vital, yet both occupied a shadowed corner of the wartime narrative. Their pride lay not in medals, but in the knowledge that without them, the front lines would have gone hungry and unarmed. Morale took root in small comforts and stubborn traditions. A harmonica played on deck, a poker game in the mess, or a superstition quietly observed before entering U-boat waters helped men steady their nerves. Many sailors carried charms or clung to rituals, refusing to whistle on deck for fear of inviting wind or tapping the rail before stepping below. Humor lightened grim days, Nicknames for ships, captains, and even the armed guard guns passed the hours. These touches of humanity gave shape to lives otherwise spent staring at an endless gray horizon, making survival not only possible but bearable. Heroism aboard Liberty ships seldom made headlines, yet it was lived out in countless acts of courage. Boatswains deciding to cut adrift blazing cargo, engineers keeping crippled machinery alive, gunners opening fire on diving aircraft. Such decisions, made in seconds, determined the fate of ships and crews. Ordinary men became leaders under fire, their choices carving the line between survival and disaster. The decks of Liberty ships were not battlefields in the traditional sense, but they demanded the same resolve. In their perseverance, these mariners embodied a quiet, unheralded courage, one that kept the arteries of war open even as danger pressed in from every horizon. The Jeremiah O'Brien entered service in 1943, one Liberty ship among many, her gray hull indistinguishable from her sisters. Her first voyages took her into the Atlantic lifeline, sailing with convoys that carried the raw necessities of survival to Britain. Deep in her holds lay ammunition, canned rations, fuel drums, and spare parts, all of it destined to feed a nation under siege. For her crew, each departure from the American coast carried the same question: would they return? U-boats hunted relentlessly, and every Liberty ship was a target. Arrival in port was not routine. It was a small victory, proof that vigilance and discipline had once again outrun fate. The O'Brien story began not in glory, but in the grinding reality of repeated crossings, each one essential, each one uncertain. Her most iconic role came in June 1944, when she became part of the vast armada gathered for Operation Neptune, the naval spearhead of D-Day. Off the beaches of Normandy, the O'Brien anchored among hundreds of other ships, her decks stacked with the cargo that would fuel the liberation of Europe. Under threat from German aircraft, artillery, and mines, her crew labored to unload supplies, working through the din of battle. Every sling of ammunition, every crate of food, every barrel of fuel she delivered became lifeblood for the soldiers clawing their way inland. Liberty ships like the O'Brien made the difference between a beachhead that held and one that starved. Their contribution was not glamorous, but without them the invasion could not have succeeded. Life aboard during the invasion was tense, chaotic, and exhausting. Above decks, armed guard gunners stood watch, scanning the skies for dive bombers or strafing fighters. Below, sailors worked in cramped holds, sweating as they prepared cargo for discharge, their ears ringing with the distant rumble of artillery. The decks vibrated with the clash of battle nearby, yet work never stopped. Fatigue became a constant companion, but purpose carried the men forward. They knew that what passed across their decks reached directly into the foxholes and gun pits ashore. Their labor was the silent counterpart to the soldiers' fight, each crate of rations or shells as vital as the rifle or helmet in a man's hands. The O'Brien's war was also marked by near misses and moments when catastrophe seemed only a heartbeat away. Engines faltered at sea, repaired on the fly by engineers who refused to surrender to breakdowns. Convoys saw ships ahead and astern struck by torpedoes, the O'Brien spared by chance or vigilance. Storms threatened to break her apart. Cargo shifted dangerously in heavy seas, and crowded anchorages brought constant risk of collision. Yet through it all, she endured. Each brush with disaster reinforced the truth of her service. That survival was earned voyage by voyage, decision by decision, by the hands and resolve of her crew. Even after the thunder of Normandy faded, the O'Brien's work continued. She shuttled supplies between Britain and newly liberated French ports, her cargo sustaining armies now driving eastward toward Germany. These voyages lacked the drama of the invasion, but they were no less essential. Each ton she delivered added momentum to the Allied advance, ensuring that offensives did not stall for lack of food, fuel, or ammunition. The O'Brien's record was not of a single heroic act, but of consistent, unrelenting service. She embodied the Liberty Fleet itself, unglamorous, unyielding, and indispensable. The arithmetic of victory in the Second World War was written not in battles won but in cargo delivered, and Liberty ships were the numbers behind that equation. By war's end, two 710 had been launched, a fleet of gray workhorses that collectively carried millions of tons of supplies. Each ship could haul over 9,000 tons, and a single convoy of 30 Liberties meant nearly 300,000 tons delivered in one crossing. That tonnage translated directly into divisions fed, armies armed, and air forces supplied with fuel and bombs. Where Germany hoped to choke the Allies through attrition, the Liberty fleet overwhelmed that strategy with sheer capacity. The Allies could lose ships and still surge ahead, because the stream of new vessels was relentless. In this industrial calculus, Liberty ships became as decisive as tanks or bombers. The reach of these ships extended far beyond the Atlantic. In the Arctic, Liberty ships braved some of the most dangerous waters on Earth to deliver Lend-Lease cargo to the Soviet Union. Convoys bound for Murmansk and Archangel carried tanks, trucks, aviation fuel, and food, all under constant threat from U-boats, Luftwaffe bombers, and ice-choked seas. Losses were heavy, yet enough ships arrived to bolster the Red Army, sustaining the Eastern Front in its grimmest hours. In the Indian Ocean, Liberty ships supplied British and Commonwealth forces, feeding campaigns in North Africa and the Middle East. Across the Pacific, they became the backbone of amphibious warfare, carrying the steel matting for runways, bulldozers for the Seabees, and the endless ammunition needed to storm island after island. Logistics was no longer a background detail, it was the foundation of strategy. In North Africa, Montgomery's ability to defeat Rommel was tied to Liberty cargoes delivering spare parts, fuel, and artillery shells. In Italy, the slow grind up the peninsula depended on steady resupply by sea. At Normandy, the difference between a fragile beachhead and a growing offensive was measured in the tonnage Liberty ships could land each day. Even in the vast Pacific, where distances dwarfed anything in Europe, Liberty ships carried the essentials that made island hopping possible. They were the invisible infrastructure of victory, ensuring that every plan drawn on a map could be executed in reality. The program's genius lay not in building perfect ships, but in building enough ships. Losses were expected, and in some cases accepted. A torpedoed Liberty was not the end of a campaign if another ship was already en route with replacement cargo. This resilience baffled German strategists, who found that even their most successful attacks did not cripple Allied supply. Every time a U-boat sank a freighter, American yards launched two more. The arithmetic of war had shifted. The Allies could absorb losses and still outproduce the enemy, turning industrial abundance into a weapon as potent as any battleship. In this sense, Liberty ships themselves became symbols of strategic philosophy. They were not designed to impress, but to endure. They represented a doctrine of redundancy and persistence, where quantity created quality. Their very ordinariness was their strength replaceable, adaptable, and always available. For generals and admirals, the presence of Liberty ships on the horizon meant confidence in launching bold offensives. For the enemy, their ceaseless arrival meant despair, a recognition that no matter how many they destroyed, more would come. In their holds lay the essence of Allied victory, the ability to project power endlessly across oceans until the enemy could no longer resist. When the war ended, the Liberty fleet suddenly seemed like a relic of urgency past. Built for 5 years of hard use, most were retired quickly, their steel sold for scrap, or their hulls consigned to mothball fleets in quiet anchorages. The wartime miracle had produced more ships than peace required, and many vanished almost as swiftly as they had appeared. Yet some endured, sold into commercial service, and carrying cargo into the 1960s and even beyond. They steamed in quieter waters now, stripped of their guns, yet their lines still spoke of wartime necessity. For those who had sailed them, seeing a Liberty ship under peacetime colors was like glimpsing an old soldier still marching, scarred but unbowed. The Jeremiah O'Brien's post-war fate followed a different path. Laid up in the National Defense Reserve Fleet near San Francisco, she spent decades forgotten, one gray hull among hundreds, preserved more by neglect than intent. Yet her survival offered an opportunity. In the 1970s, volunteers began restoring her, driven by a vision of keeping history alive not in photographs or museum displays, but in steam and steel. They coaxed her boilers back to life, repainted her hull, and brought her once more to working order. Unlike most memorial ships, she was not meant to be static. She would sail again, carrying her story into the present with the same heartbeat that had carried her across oceans of war. Her greatest triumph in preservation came in 1994 when she crossed the Atlantic under her own power to join the 50th anniversary commemorations of D-Day. The voyage was no small feat. By then she was 50 years old, maintained not by a navy but by volunteers. Yet she made the crossing proudly, her triple expansion engine chugging as reliably as ever. Off the beaches of Normandy, the O'Brien once again dropped anchor, this time as a living monument. Visitors walked her decks, heard her machinery, and touched the steel that had carried war cargo half a century before. It was history not read in a book, but felt through the soles of their shoes, smelled in the oil and steam, heard in the deep vibration of her heart. Today, the O'Brien remains one of only 2 Liberty ships still operational, her preserved condition a rare portal into the past. She serves as a museum and as a reminder, a place where visitors can step back into the world of the 1940s and imagine life aboard. Her survival elevates her from mere artifact to symbol, standing for the thousands of ships and millions of men and women whose labor and courage sustained victory. For every schoolchild who hears her engine, every veteran who walks her decks, she renews the lesson that wars are not won by front lines alone. They are won by the steady, unyielding work of those who keep the lifelines open, across seas as dangerous as any battlefield. The story of the Liberty ships is ultimately one of endurance, a quality expressed in steel, in industry, and in the men who sailed them across hostile seas. Built by the thousands, they transformed the odds in a war where logistics was often the hidden battlefield. The Jeremiah O'Brien, plain and boxy as the day she was launched, remains the most vivid example of that legacy. She was not designed to impress, only to serve. Yet her survival allows us to hear, see, and feel what those wartime voyages meant. Through her we remember how America's factories and workers became an arsenal of democracy, producing not only weapons, but the ships to carry them. Her engine's beat still resonates like a wartime drum, echoing the resilience of an age when victory was forged as much by welders and shipwrights as by generals and admirals. To speak of the O'Brien is to speak also of the anonymous thousands who made her possible. In crowded shipyards, welders worked amid showers of sparks, men and women learned new trades overnight, and immigrants found themselves building ships for a war half a world away. At sea, merchant mariners and armed guards endured cold nights under blackout, storms that iced the decks, and the constant dread of torpedoes. Their sacrifice was immense. Their casualty rates were among the highest of any wartime service, and yet recognition was slow to arrive. What kept them going was not fame or promise of reward, but the knowledge that every successful voyage meant food in a soldier's mess tin, fuel in a tank, or ammunition in a rifle. Their quiet courage ensured that Allied offensives did not falter for lack of supplies. The Liberty ship legacy continues today not only in museums and history books, but in the broader lessons they represent. They remind us that wars are not won solely by the clash of armies or the brilliance of strategy, but by the unbroken chain of supply that keeps those armies fighting. The Jeremiah O'Brien's continued operation embodies that lesson in a way no static exhibit can. Visitors who step aboard feel the thrum of her triple expansion engine, smell the oil and steam, and walk the narrow passageways once crowded with wartime sailors. In those moments, the distance between past and present collapses, and the hidden dimension of victory becomes tangible. She is more than an artifact. She is a heartbeat from another era, kept alive through dedication and memory. As her boilers fire and her propeller turns, the O'Brien carries forward a message that transcends her steel. Freedom endures not only because of those who fight at the front, but because of those who sustain them unseen. Her decks whisper of nights at sea, her hull still bears the echoes of convoys run under fire, and her survival embodies the triumph of ordinary people meeting extraordinary demands. In her story, the fleet of Liberty ships lives on, their contribution measured not in glamour but in persistence. Even the plainest vessels, given purpose and crew, can carry the weight of victory across oceans. Through the O'Brien, we remember that endurance itself can be a weapon, one that wins wars as surely as any battle fought with bullets and bayonets.
Thank you for joining us on the Trackpads Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.